We just talked about Proverbs and how Proverbs gives us a view of the world that, we don't want to make kind of rules of life that have no exceptions to them when we think about Proverbs. That if you do good, you're always going to prosper, and if you do wicked, you are always going to suffer. I mean, there are streams of Christianity that hold this even today. We call them by different names, like prosperity gospel or something like that. But there's also a part of the Christian canon and the Jewish canon that calls these very ideas into question. That says, sometimes the righteous do suffer, and sometimes the wicked do prosper. And why is that? I mean, if Proverbs is right, then why is it that we see the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? Okay, let's say Proverbs is talking about kind of tendencies in God's world. It's not speaking in absolutes. But Ecclesiastes wants to emphasize something different than this. Ecclesiastes wants to emphasize kind of the mystery of life, and the times in life where things just don't go the way we think they should go. Now, the book is also called Kohelet, which means preacher or teacher, and some people would call this alternative wisdom literature because it's really so different in its perspective from Proverbs. It's more pessimistic. Now, Fee and Stewart talk about some disagreement they have, whether it is actually that much more pessimistic. I think it is a fairly pessimistic text. But let's look at some of the things that it talks about, and you can decide for yourself. Okay, hang on here. I'm getting my papers in order. So Ecclesiastes, look at 1:1 through 4. The word of the teacher, Kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, vanity of vanities, says the teacher. The word in Hebrew is hevel. It just means like breath, something that's ephemeral, something that's come and just, it's there and it's gone. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, or everything is just breath. Do you have a translation that's different than that one? Different than vanity?
Smoke, nothing but smoke. That's what the Quester says. There's nothing to anything. It's all smoke.
Smoke, okay. So is that the Message that translates this word smoke?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And is there another besides vanity?
There's
yes.
a paragraph, there's a margin, but this is in the New American Standard, and in the marginal note it says futility of futilities.
Futility, yeah. And so verse 3, what do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Look at verse 9. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. And perhaps 118 sums it all up. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. So Proverbs is kind of a happy book, and Ecclesiastes is kind of a sad book. It's depressing. And I'm glad they're both in the Bible. Okay, James Sanders, biblical scholar, he talks about the sacred tensions within the text. And he talks about the Bible's self-correcting function. That maybe if Proverbs lists too much one way at times, and Ecclesiastes lists too much one way at other times, then together, you see, they form a sacred tension, which really gets in a more realistic way at how life really is. Because it is true that there are ways of living that are more likely to bring you happiness than others. And yet it's also true that sometimes the righteous suffer and sometimes the wicked prosper. And we have to be realistic about both of these. We don't want to be Pollyannas and unrealistically optimistic, but at the same time, we don't want to be so pessimistic that we never expect any of God's blessing in our lives. Look at 2:12 through 17. So I turn to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the one do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness. Yet I perceived that the same fate befalls them all. So he's quoting a common proverb there. And he says, but the same fate befalls the wise and fools. They all end up in the grave, he says. Then I said to myself, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said to myself that this is also vanity. It's also breath, futility, smoke. For there is no enduring remembrance of the wise or fools, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How can the wise die just like fools? So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a chasing after wind. Look at verse 22. What do mortals get from all the toil and strain with which they toil under the sun? For all their days are full of pain, and their work is a vexation. Even at night their minds do not rest. This is also vanity. Now, this is challenging what Ecclesiastes is doing. Is it's kind of issuing a theological challenge to works like Proverbs and writings like Deuteronomy. In fact, the whole section of the Bible called the Deuteronomistic history really has kind of a cause and effect theology, or very close to it anyway, that God says, if you keep the law, if you abide by my commandments, you're going to prosper. And if you don't, you're going to be cursed. And Proverbs doesn't go that far, but it tells us there are ways of living that are more likely to bring you happiness and lead you into God's ways than other ways of living. And Ecclesiastes says, I hear that, but I look around me and I don't always see it. Let's look at 12, 1 through 8. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble, and the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return with the rain. In the day when the guards of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the women who grind cease working because they are few, and those who look through the windows see dimly. When the doors on the street are shut, and the sound of grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. When one is afraid of heights, and terrors are in the road, the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because all must go to their eternal home. And the mourners will go about the streets before the silver cord is snapped, and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, all is vanity. That is sad.
Yes.
That is a sad picture of the world. And, when it says that all will go to their home, this is a pre-Christian text. This isn't a text where there's any kind of meaningful sense of the afterlife. And insofar as there's an idea of the afterlife, the idea is this shadowy place, Sheol. Which is it's not a particularly wonderful place. It's nowhere. It's nothing like the kind of vision of the renewed heaven and earth that we get in the New Testament. And so when Ecclesiastes is looking at the world, it's saying you can work hard, you can get rich, you can be poor, you can be lazy, you can do whatever you want, but you're going to end up dead. And so everything is ephemeral. Everything's here and gone, and it's all vanity. And so I think that this is not a very inspiring text, and in some ways it's a kind of a sobering text. And it reminds us that the life of faith has joy, and the life of faith has sorrow. These are just part of it. And the life of faith is incomplete without either of these. Now, the vision of Ecclesiastes at the end of the day is one that in some ways I find realistic and in some ways I find inadequate. Okay? Because on the one hand, I'm cognizant of the fact that the righteous don't always prosper and the wicked don't always suffer. And sometimes bad things happen to good people, and sometimes good things happen to bad people. That's life. And Ecclesiastes is utterly realistic about this fact. At the same time, I don't think that life is vanity, and I don't think that life is breath. Because I've got the rest of the biblical canon, including the New Testament, which teaches me that life really does have meaning, and that God wants us to live in a particular way in our lives in order to honor Him, and that whether we do good or whether we do evil, these things actually have consequences, and those consequences mean something. That there's a particular way we should live and a particular way in which we should regard other people, because God cares about those people just like He cares about you and me. You see, my self-worth, if my self-worth is derived from what I have or what I do or how I look, then Ecclesiastes is right, and every single one of those things is going to let me down. And there's only one thing that isn't ever going to let me down, and that's my love for God and God's love for me through Jesus Christ. And that's what Ecclesiastes is missing. And so that's why I say there's part of Ecclesiastes that I embrace and part of Ecclesiastes that I don't, because I don't think it gives a complete enough view of the world that God has created. Now, another piece of alternative wisdom literature. Before we move on, anyone have any questions or comments about Ecclesiastes?
Kind of an observation.
Yeah.
His pushback against the Proverbs or against Deuteronomy is from observation. He observes that what they say is not true. Not everywhere true. But in the text from Deuteronomy, it is, thus says the Lord.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, he is putting his human experience out there
Yeah,
on parity.
yeah,
As I observe what goes on,
yeah.
this is the pushback out of everyday life against the theology which says, "Thus says the Lord," and that's quite a pushback. That's not a little shove.
So Ecclesiastes is pushing back on this notion that God has actually said the righteous will prosper, the wicked will suffer.
It seems so.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how to.
Right. Yeah, I think Ecclesiastes is doing that. There are all kinds of tensions within the Bible.
Yes.
I won't call them contradictions, but I will call them tensions. Because the Bible reflects the breadth of human engagement with the God of Israel. And human experiences vary so vastly from time to time and place to place. I mean, you know, the experience of Israelite people during the Davidic period, the period of David, the kingship of Solomon, is vastly different than it was during the period of the Assyrian exile or the period of the Babylonian exile or the period of Roman occupation. And different circumstances yield different kinds of perspectives, including theological perspectives. So, you know, the array of perspectives represented in the Bible, the diversity of perspectives in the canon, doesn't bother me. I think it's actually really important. And I think we do a disservice when we try to make everything say exactly the same thing. Okay, now Job is a little bit of a different animal. It has the feeling of kind of a folk tale. And it's getting at an issue that we call, I'm going to write this word on the board. It's getting at an issue that we call theodicy. And theodicy is asking about the justness of God. So, how is it that if God is just, bad things happen to righteous people? That's kind of what Job is getting at. How are we doing on time, by the way?
About 8 minutes.
About 8 minutes left? Okay, so we got some time here. Now, Job is a righteous man, and he's not just a little righteous. He's a lot righteous. The Bible says, there was once a man, I'm at 1:1, there was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. This is the very picture of the realization of the view of Proverbs. This Job is righteous. He's blameless, and he's blessed. He's really blessed. You can see how blessed he is. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. I mean, for an Israelite patriarch, this is pure happiness. This is as good as it gets. You got your family, they get along with each other, you're rich, you have feasts, you're righteous, you're in good standing with God. And it says that when the feasts had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." So he's very observant, and he's even offering sacrifices to cover the sins of his children, because he wants to be in good shape with God. Now, from one perspective, we know how this story is supposed to go. And they all lived happily ever after. Okay? But that's not what happened. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord. Now think of God like having a divine court. Think of God as a king, and kings had courts. And so this is God's divine court, and God's divine court is made up of angelic beings. And Satan also came among them. Now Satan here may not be a proper noun. Satan is a Hebrew word that means accuser or adversary. And this is what we see Satan doing a lot of times in the Bible. For example, here in Job, that's what Satan's going to do. But Satan also tempts Jesus, right? Satan is telling Jesus, well, if you are the Son of God, then you'll do this. He's testing Jesus. The Bible calls him the tempter. Kind of like God's DA, but in a way, the character, Satan appears in different ways in different parts of the Bible. Let's put it that way. Now, the Lord said to Satan, now notice Satan is part of God's heavenly court, so at least at this point, God and Satan are still on speaking terms. And the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it. Now, I don't know why the Lord would say this, but the Lord said to Satan, the accuser, the adversary, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. And here's where the worm turns. Then Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. Now notice, if you read through the story, Satan is wrong. Job never curses God. Job questions God. But Job never curses God. Even though other people say, why don't you just curse God and die? He doesn't do it.
That was his wife.
That was his wife, yeah.
Because he was totally ignoring her.
Because he was totally ignoring her. Okay, well,
This wasn't
And
just
her
his
loss
loss.
wasn't just his loss.
yeah. That's true. It was her loss too.
Pretty egotistical story.
Pretty egotistical story from a masculine perspective. Thank
I
you.
always thought of it that way.
I think that is probably very true. Yeah. It's certainly told from the man's perspective, as most of the Bible is. Not all of the Bible, but most of the Bible. The Lord said to Satan, very well, all that he has is in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against him. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now, Job is going to be put to the test. And Satan has basically free reign against Job now, but he can't kill him. Now, why does God do this? I don't know. In one sense, God doesn't do anything that hurts Job, but in another sense, God does give Satan the permission to do the things that hurt Job. And it's unclear what God's motivations might be to do this. But nevertheless, once he says to Satan, very well, all that he has is in your power, that's when these things begin to happen to Job. Okay, why don't we stop there and then we'll pick up in just a minute on the next part of Job.